that allowed the city to hit the reset button, introducing many of the new features of building in the modern age, glass and steel, concrete, and also the provision of parks, which is highlighted by the 1893 Columbia World's Fair. So by 1900, Chicago had 1 million people, and even though there still were many problems, it was probably a more livable city because of the application of these concepts of urban planning. So here we see a city that has not been planned. This is Manchester, which grew from essentially a village in 1750 to the second largest city in the United Kingdom in 1850. So if you look here, you can see the lack of design and planning. If you just look at this section of the city, for example, here, if you were an outsider, you would struggle mightily to figure out where you were trying to go if you were from point A to point B here, because you would have to go streets that don't go all the way through, and they would curve. And that's why when we introduced some of these grid-like structures, it was to help with what's called the legibility of the city. So if you're an outsider, it's just being able to read something as if you had a bird's eye view and a map. So this idea of urban planning has been around since the ancient world. Obviously, it reached some new levels during the growth of cities in Europe during this period, when you have basically a doubling of the population between about 1840 and 1914. So the concept of urban planning is illustrated pretty well here by René Descartes. So keep in mind that Descartes is a scientist and a mathematician. So as he says, these old cities of Europe that have gradually grown from mere villages into large towns are usually less well laid out than the orderly towns that planners lay out as they wish on level ground. So much less that from the way the buildings are arranged in the old cities, a tall one here, a small one there, and the way they make the streets crooked and irregular, you would think they've been placed where they are by chance rather than by the will of thinking men. And this is not surprising that the aesthetic of an analytic geometer or mathematician wouldn't be something that's creative or unique per se, or in diversion from a pattern, but it would be the pattern itself. It would be a clear grid-like structure so that you could read it off as you would a geometry problem. So let's look at some of these actually planned out cities. So this is London, and this is the area called the Crystal Palace. So this was during the exhibition in 1851. This was actually designed by the husband of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert. And here we have the actual Crystal Palace, which is the front of the largest glass building in the world. Here's the railroad that took people, and also the subway to and from the exhibition. You can see there's a provision of parks